My name again is Zoe Weil, and I have written this book, Most Good Least Harm, and I'm going to be doing a presentation on the book, but it's almost like a little bit of a mini workshop, and the talk I'm going to give actually sometimes is an 8-hour workshop, but I'm going to really condense it, and I'm not going to keep you here until whatever 8 hours from now would be, which would be like 3 in the morning or something, so don't worry. So I think I'd like to begin by telling you how I came to even write this book, which brings me back to 1987, but I promise I won't tell you my whole life story, even though that was 22 years ago. So 22 years ago, I was looking for a summer job, and I was in graduate school, and I felt like I could teach a bunch of things. And so I called up the director of a program at the University of Pennsylvania that offered week-long courses to secondary school students, 7th and 8th graders. And I said, I'd love to teach a whole bunch of courses for your program. And she said, okay, what would you like to teach? And I said, well, I'd like to do one on critical television watching, and I'd like to do one on world religions, and one on animal issues, and one on environmental issues, and one on creative writing. And she said, that sounds great, sure. Well, she was saying that sounds great, sure, apparently to lots of people, because there were many, many, many courses offered that summer. In fact, there were 60 courses offered that summer, and there weren't nearly enough kids to fill 60 courses. So shockingly enough, my critical television watching course was canceled due to lack of enrollment. However, several of my courses, 3 of my courses did run, and the animal issues course was actually the second most popular of the 60 that were offered that summer. And many people, when I say that, want to know, well, what was more popular than that, and so that was robotics. So even in 1987, they were teaching robotics, and it was very popular, and animal issues was second to that. So I taught this course. It met from Monday through Friday from 9 to 5, and I watched as the kids who came into the course on Monday were very different by Friday. And one of the shifts that happened for one kid happened overnight. So I talked about a particular issue on Wednesday, and he was moved by it, he was upset by what he learned, he wanted to make a difference. So that night he went home and he made his own homemade leaflets. And he brought them back the next morning, and he said, do you mind during lunch if I hand them out? And so during lunch, he stood out on a Philadelphia street corner while the rest of us were inside eating, and he handed out his homemade leaflets to passers-by. And at the end of that week, I had an inkling that I had found my life's work, and that it had a name, and the name was Humane Education. And it became my goal to teach about the interconnected issues of human rights and environment and animal issues and culture and change, in order to give young people the information and the motivation to be change makers, to make a difference in the world. So I ended up being hired by a nonprofit organization, and I ended up starting a program at that nonprofit where I went into schools in the Philadelphia area, and I did presentations and assembly programs and after-school programs and classroom courses and a whole variety of things, reaching about 10,000 students a year. And one of the things I used to do when I was invited to do an assembly program, which was often for a few hundred antsy kids, is I'd have to figure out how to do something sort of lively on stage. And this was before PowerPoint, not that I know how to use PowerPoint now, but still, I had to come up with some sort of song and dance. So what I did is I brought a canvas bag, and I put a bunch of props in it. And the props would represent 2 choices. So for example, there might be a styrofoam cup in there and a ceramic mug. Or there might be a plastic bag, which I would contrast with the canvas bag that I brought everything with. Or there might be a cloth diaper and a disposable diaper. Just a variety of things that represented a choice. And I would ask the students, which of these 2 things does more good and less harm? So after years of asking that question, I realized that this had actually become the guiding principle of my own life. How can I do the most good and the least harm in relation to myself, to other people, to other species, and to the environment? And so I went on to get a little bit frustrated with the limits of my own humane education programs, because even though 10,000 students a year sounds like a lot, I wanted to reach millions of people, and so I ended up co-founding the Institute in order to train other people to be humane educators so that we could create this bigger movement of education. And moved to Maine, and we started some programs which I'll tell you about at the end of my talk. And I wrote some books for kids. I wrote a book for parents on how to raise humane children. I wrote a book for teachers called The Power and Promise of Humane Education. And finally, I sat down and I wrote a book for the general public, Most Good, Least Harm, that brought this concept and these ideas to anybody who was interested in aligning their values and their choices in their life. Well, when you think about this concept, and I've shortened it and called it the MOGO Principle, MOGO being short for most good, because it's most good, least harm's a little bit of a mouthful. So when you think about this concept, it's pretty basic. Not too many people would say, hey, I don't think it's a good idea to do the most good and the least harm, and most of us agree that it's just a basic good idea. In fact, I didn't come up with it, I mean, it's been around for as long as there have been humans. So why would anybody need to write a book about doing the most good and the least harm? Well, the reason is because it's actually very challenging to live your life in a way that does the most good and the least harm. Why? Well, there's 3 reasons that I've identified. There are probably many others, but there's 3 core reasons that I think it's difficult to make choices that do the most good and the least harm. The first one is that we lack the knowledge about the effects of our everyday choices. And a couple hundred years ago, even 100 years ago, if you lived here, you would know where your food came from, you would know where your fuel came from, you would know where the building materials that made your house came from, you would know where your transportation came from, and now we have no idea. We are connected through all our daily choices through an interwoven web that crosses the globe often several times. So we just don't know. We lack the knowledge to make choices that do the most good and the least harm. Come on in. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is that we often lack the will to gain that knowledge. And the reason why I think we lack the will to gain the knowledge is because it's hard. And sometimes if we gain knowledge that is disturbing, it may force us to have a conflict between our values and our desires. So if you discover that something that you love doing or you love eating or you love wearing comes at a tremendous cost to other people or to other species or the environment, but you really love that thing, then all of a sudden you have a conflict. And I think most of us would prefer to avoid that conflict, and so we may lack the will to gain the knowledge to enable us to make MOGO choices.